Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai ki EMA Burnout webinar. Hello everybody, welcome to the EMA Burnout webinar. My name is John Bradbury. I'm a People Experience Growth Advisor here at the EMA. Today's webinar, we're going to be talking about the subject of burnout, and we're very pleased to have you joining us. And there will be opportunity for you to join in and interact with this webinar through slido.com. So if you want to go to slido.com and hashtag burnout, you'll be able to ask questions through Slido. And also we'll have some polls on that and questions for you during the webinar. But I think most importantly, to kick things off, I need to introduce our three guests who are all experts in this area and bring different perspectives to help organisations and people. And they are, I think in the first instance, I'd like to introduce Sarah McGuinness. Ready for her to introduce herself. And thank you, Sarah. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you. Kia ora, everybody. And great to be here with you and really excited to be exploring this topic. So my name is Sarah McGuinness. I'm the CEO and founder of Revolutionaries of Wellbeing. I've spent my career in behaviour change, although my joke is that I burnt out myself, so I didn't take any of my own advice. My qualifications are in psychology, communications, health behaviour change, obviously, and in training and assessment as well. So at the Revolutionaries of Wellbeing, we look at what we eat, breathe, sleep, wellbeing strategy and consulting. And we're also involved in a network of wellbeing managers as well. So we're constantly talking to amazing people around the globe about what they're doing, the good, the bad and the ugly when it comes to wellbeing at work.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm very, very excited and interesting to hear what you have to say today. And also online, we have Georgie Thomas. Georgie, would you like to introduce yourself too, please?
Yes, kia ora everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm a research fellow at the University of Auckland, and also I am the director of a consultancy called Heart and Brain Works. And we work with organizations to conduct psychosocial hazard audits. So psychosocial hazards are aspects of work that detrimentally impact mental health. And so we work with organizations in that capacity. And I'm also the creator of the only scientifically validated program in Australia and New Zealand to reduce stress and burnout in the workplace called the Wellbeing Protocol. I am very excited to be here with you today, as I mentioned, and to be sharing with you lots of knowledge.
Thank you so much, Georgie. That sounds a very rigorous scientific background that you'll bring to bear today, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that. The third guest that I have sitting here with me in the studio is Professor Jared Ha. Jared, would you like to introduce yourself too, please?
So, kia ora everybody. Ko tani wita waka, ko Ngāti Maniapoto, me Ngāti Mahuta, na iwi, ko Jared Ha toko ingoa. So I am a professor of human resource management at AUT. I've been researching burnout since I started my PhD a long time ago. Now, but I've also been doing these workforce, I guess, audits around wellbeing and specifically on burnout since just before COVID. I started in February, and so I have about 7,000, have data from about 7,000 employees to date. So I'm hoping to provide some kind of tracking data on how burnout is looking. So kia ora, lovely to be here, and look forward to answering some questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. It sounds like a wealth of data that you have that you'll be able to inform the answers that are to the subjects that we talk about today. Now, I thought actually what we do is just really try and get everyone's voice in the room just to kick us off, because recently the EMA and NIB did a wellbeing survey, and one of the key questions that we asked on that is the one that we have up on Slido now, which is about in the last 3 months, as a result of work, how many employees have experienced negative physical effects, including fatigue, problems sleeping and headaches. And we're just really interested to see what people think is the answer that we've got to that question. So if you want to join in and put your answers to that, it's 91%, 67% or 46% are the three choices. Okay, so it looks like that's sort of starting to settle down with some themes. Certainly nobody's thinking, I was about to say nobody's thinking there's only 46%, but I see some people that are thinking that. Okay, so it definitely looks like it's settling down there, with most people certainly seeing that it being that very high figure of 91%. And interestingly, that is the result that we got from the survey. So I thought that might be a good sort of starting off point for our panel for people to give their kind of views on that. Georgie, what do you think about that figure? Does that surprise you?
It doesn't really surprise me. So in the work that we've done with different companies, we are getting similar results. I think it is important to note that post-COVID, we have seen a rise in mental distress globally, in instances of anxiety, depression, and rates of burnout. And so that certainly is affecting workplaces in New Zealand and Australia as well. And yeah, I am not surprised, unfortunately.
Oh, very interesting. Jared, what about you? Does it surprise you?
No, so my data would suggest across, so that's 7,000, or 7 different times, roughly about 1,000 people are shot. Less than 2% at every time period would basically say, nope, don't have any burnout symptoms at all. So I would literally say less than, so it's this extreme minority who are totally unaffected by work, and everybody else has some kind of, I use a toast analogy, some kind of, some kind of heat on the bread right up to the burnt piece of toast, which would be obviously burnt out, and we don't want to be there. But no, those figures are high, but I think it captures well the kind of reality we're still in now, even 2.5 years after kind of COVID started here. So we're not out of the woods yet.
Very good, thank you very much. And Sarah, what's your take on that figures?
Yeah, I would agree with the other two panelists in that I'm not surprised at all. And I guess what's always interesting for me is kind of what sits behind that. So if we look at, just that physical thing, perhaps, it's headaches or whatever, from a stress management point of view, stress is a normal part of life, and it might be that we are experiencing those things. I think it's the level that we're seeing and the consistency, the chronicness of those things, and how long, those symptoms are prolonged for people now. So I think that's for me what sort of, when I first saw that, was like, that's interesting as a data point, but I guess what's more interesting is that longitudinal nature, and I suppose that speaks, Jared, very much to your research around, we are seeing this increase, we are seeing those trends, and it doesn't seem to be dissipating yet.
Okay, thanks very much, Sarah. So definitely this trend that people are reflecting on and saying, well, the trend is upwards, that maybe it's been accentuated by COVID and the fallout from that. So the question a lot of our members would be thinking is, as business owners and as leaders in business, what could we do about that? How could we spot what's happening, and what could we put in place in our organizations to address that? What do you think on that, Jared?
Oh, lovely. Kia ora, everybody. So I think for business owners and leaders, being proactive, and I think the take home should be here, is that chances are most of the workforce is experiencing, and Sarah raises a very good point. It is about those kind of chronic levels, right? It's not that everybody's a bit tired. Actually, some people are massively fatigued, and we want to be proactive and front-footed, and a lot of it is around workload. And I know some, businesses, for example, and we've got somebody from Queenstown there, where I was reading, they've got 12-year-olds working in the restaurant to try to shore up shortages in human resources, which is a good strategy. But again, I think it's just trying to do everything you can, focusing on the well-being and letting people have time off, relieving that pressure, because at the moment we are in a kind of a crazy dynamic. And I do see that at least carrying through to the end of the year.
Right, so trends that sort of continue, particularly in terms of workload for people and organisations being proactive. Sarah, what sort of things would you add to that?
Yeah, I pick up your point, Jared, one around those resourcing pieces. So we talk about in our work about 6 dials, one of them is job demands and another one is around control and another one is around resourcing. So you're absolutely right. In Queenstown, the resourcing dial, if you like, is hard baked into, warning danger zone because we are so short staffed down here. You could get a job anywhere here. You could probably pretty much walk in, and get a job tomorrow. They're so short staffed. And so I guess for organizations and leaders, it is looking at, okay, what are the other things that are within my control? And we're hearing, say, of restaurants, closing and not doing as many hours, and perhaps that's not great for the bottom line, but in terms of that sustainability of business, perhaps that's something they have to do. The other piece I would say, probably a couple of things that come to mind. The first is around, leaders actually committing to this and thinking about their own role modeling behaviors. And that shadow that leaders cast is really long. So, think about your own behaviors in terms of well-being. What are you doing to mitigate or contribute to the burnout by your own behaviors? Second of all would be around the data. So if you're looking at your organization thinking, okay, what are those kind of top key risks? And ideally you're looking at, some of those things like turnover are probably the really obvious ones, but if you've got any other data around where people are struggling, what they're finding difficult, whether it's their social connection, whether it's the amount of time they're at work, whether it's the manager employee relationship, any of those things that just give you a little bit of an idea about where to put your focus on, that would be a really great place to start. And then the last piece I would actually say is, for you as a leader, making sure you are taking care of yourself. And it probably links back to that very first piece, that if you're looking after yourself, you're actually in a much better state to be able to support those around you.
Right. Yeah, I really like that point about making sure you're thinking about yourself as well as your staff, because then you're there for them and able to help and advise. Georgie, what sort of things would you add, and what's your sort of take on this?
Yeah, I really like Sarah's point with regards to data-driven decisions. So I just want to add or perhaps expand that point a little bit more. As a leader, it is important to understand that one of the most valuable assets for you is having data around what is actually the mental health state of your employees right now, and also data around the aspects of work that might impact employee mental health. So it is important for you to conduct audits of your workplace and get this particular data. We have most organizations run, for example, engagement surveys. Now, engagement surveys are not sufficient to provide accurate data. You want a survey that is specialized in looking at what we call psychosocial hazards. So those aspects of work that can impact mental health. And what are those aspects of work? For example, workload, work pace, relationship with supervisor, relationship with colleagues, autonomy, role clarity. These are just some examples. So when you are in an organization, a lot of the time when we work with organizations, they come to us because they have anecdotal evidence that their people are struggling, right? So we come in and we say, okay, well, these are the stress levels, these are the burnout levels, these are the hazards, right? So it's important for you when you measure this to actually have and adopt a risk assessment approach. So just like when you have health and safety professionals, we have a long tradition of monitoring risks to physical health. We need to step up our game when it comes to monitoring the risk to mental health. And so for that, you need to actually run these assessments that give you risk scores for different areas. So then you know, right, where you have to intervene. And just one example, usually people think, oh, it's workload, but I can't reduce workload because there are staff shortages. And one example, we've worked with an organization with over 800 employees. Workload was endemic in the industry, so it's a hazard that they cannot eliminate. But what we found actually, the problem was that people felt compelled to be in meetings too much and too long, and they actually didn't have time to complete their tasks. And so the intervention, the decision that you make after you get the data can have a significant impact on your people, on your people's well-being.
That's really interesting. So I'm hearing common themes in what you all three said there around very much around thinking around workload, thinking about relationships with colleagues, and think of the implication of that. There's also that kind of vicious cycle where there are there's a heavy workload, so there's job vacancies, so people are doing a wee bit more than normal, and that bit having to be sustained over a period of time. And these are all things which I think the phrase was used about sort of anecdotal. These are things you kind of notice perhaps as you're walking around in a business and see. And what I'm hearing from you is around the importance of working out exactly what it is that's happening in your organization, what the data is for your particular organization at a particular time. So once an organization has started to take a view on what it is they need to work on, done some sort of diagnostic, I think was the phrase you used there, Georgie, what are the sort of things that organizations you're coming across that are doing that are dealing with this well? Do you have some examples, Sarah, of organizations that have addressed burnout in their organization and done it well in your view?
It's a really good question, and I'm trying to think of an organization that's done it well. Given you look at this percentage of people that are struggling, I'm not sure I could name an organization. Jared, Georgie, feel free to jump in on this one. Who doesn't have burnout to some degree. I guess the ones that I'm seeing, in terms of initiatives or strategies that they put in place that are really strong. And this, I think, this one doesn't link just to burnout, but mental health in general. And one is around that leadership and that storytelling. So storytelling is incredibly powerful. So if there are people who have been through that experience, can talk openly about what it was like to go through and the recovery period, that in itself can really change cultures. Second is that peer-to-peer relationship. So whether it's having mental health first aiders on the floor or whether it's having others who are trained as a peer support person, that's been a really good initiative. And other ones then are just around, I think, getting those conversations out in the open and that real acknowledgement for people. And I'm trying to think, of some of the organizations that have done this, really well. I think, New Zealand Post has been doing quite a lot on the ground floor, if you like, around some psychosocial health initiatives, especially that peer-to-peer relationship work. Some of the other sort of franchise organizations that we work with have done something very similar. And I think it's trying to make the most of the very limited time and resources you have available and trying to almost, if people are already talking, how do we enhance the conversations that they're having? We're not adding something extra to their workload because we should be seen to be doing well-being.
That's great. There's some really nice examples there, I think, around, it sounds like sort of a programmatic sort of approach to doing things and very much working on relationships. What sort of advice would you give for organizations? What sort of things do you see organizations doing well on this?
So I think there is, my data would suggest we have about 20% of New Zealand firms doing a really good job. Now, every time I say that, it always disappoints me that it's 20%. It's not even half, right? So those 20% are doing things like offering EAPs, developing good relationships between leaders and their co-workers, the followers, so good relationship building, being able to access support. And a lot of it will be things like also, following up with a wellbeing app, something to aid people's well-beings. But there's obviously lots of organizations who need to improve. And I think a fundamental thing for a lot of leaders is acknowledging that, yes, we probably have a problem and unfortunately probably not doing a great job. And that's not to be, critical of people. It's just to say, hey, the report card reads a D, it needs to do better, or a C, and we need to be at the A level. So it's just acknowledging and then trying to make those steps. And probably the best one, and we've talked the importance of leadership here already, is getting the managers, those who are engaging with the workforce in general, to make sure their well-being is improved, because they will then have a better relationship with the workforce.
Thanks very much, Jared. So lots of organisations, it sounds like, need a hand to improve what they're doing, but there are some examples around of organisations that have done well. And Georgie, to go back to you in terms of, because you mentioned the diagnostic. So once a diagnostic has been done, what sort of things, in terms of organisations, what sort of programs or processes are put in place typically in your view?
In my experience, the most successful organizations are those where the leadership is actually committed to being transparent about the results of the diagnostic and transparent about their commitment to actually make changes. And being also realistic that change will take time. But that transparency and honesty, as both Jared and Sarah talked about, is a key element, right? So the second one, and I want to build on Jared's point with regards to managers and supporting managers. And I think, Jared, your research was showing that middle managers are the most impacted by burnout rates. And I think it was something like they were 143 times more likely to suffer from burnout. And that's, I apologize if I don't remember the numbers correctly, but that has certainly been the case in my work as well. And so I think it's very important for measures to put into place to support middle managers, both in terms of their own mental health and well-being, but also in terms of giving them tools to create work environments that are psychologically healthy and safe.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that certainly makes sense to me in terms of sort of middle management being sort of squeezed and being very vital in terms of, again, that point about thinking about your own mental health and well-being, but thinking of the impact on the people that you manage in terms of their well-being as well. I thought it might be a time now actually to just do a poll. We do have a poll here, question to ask people. And that question would be about your organisation. So if we could get the poll up, it would be, do you think burnout is a problem in your organisation at the moment? So is the answer yes, somewhat, or no?
Not many in the no category.
Yes, I was trying to figure out how many people that represents, but I mean, certainly that's pretty clear that in organisations, people are saying it's somewhat a problem, and the majority of people actually saying very definitely a problem. So, you know, we certainly understand why these things are being talked about so much now. If people are thinking that it's a problem. Just on that, just to sort of take a slightly different perspective on this, because we started to talk about solutions, but I just wondered, what would you think about in terms of the costs to organisations of this burnout? Where we're really saying in the majority of organisations, you know, burnout is a problem. Sarah, what would you say were the sort of hidden costs of that?
I actually just wanted to jump back a point, just looking at that poll, thinking one thing that's really interesting, so this is completely unrelated to the question you just asked me, is having been through burnout myself, I think, you know, there's kind of a sliding scale when you're kind of aware that you're not tracking very well, and then you start to descend into this place where you almost become a little bit disconnected from reality, and you're actually not a very good judge of your own well-being. And there's plenty of data to back up that kind of cognitive shift that you have. And so it's quite interesting looking at that, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of people who are thinking, I'm not burnt out, I'm fine, when actually, you know, for the peers around them, it'll be looking at them going, that person doesn't seem okay. And that just, sorry, goes back to that whole point about why it's so important for leaders and managers and support people to be able to kind of pick up those signs and symptoms when you may not be able to yourself. To your cost question, yeah, I think that one of the challenges around this is there's obviously lots of you know, metrics we could look at, whether it was kind of turnover or absenteeism or presenteeism or all those things. But actually, there's a whole lot of hidden costs around if you're losing really good talent because they think that the culture is really toxic and they're going to your competitors, and your competitors are getting that advantage from those, you know, those great people, or whether it's those ripple effects, if you like, of what happens when you've got, and I know a friend of mine actually whose husband is absolutely teetering on burnout. She described him as coming home and crying 3 nights a week. And so you can imagine what that effect is doing to his family, and her having to support him, and then her also going to her job. And there's these kind of spiraling costs in it. So which says to me that, yeah, this is really important to deal with, but it's also a systemic thing that we all have a responsibility. It's not just a cost in terms of dollars, but it's a societal cost as well.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. There's a whole ripple effect from one individual to their family, to their wider circle, and as you say, to society as a whole. What about you, Georgie? What do you see as some of the hidden costs for organisations about that?
Yeah, and so certainly there is that ripple effect, and we actually know from literature, Christina Maslow is probably one of the key researchers of burnout globally, and so she talks about burnout being contagious. So if you have one person in your team, it is likely to spread. And also there's something called the burnout cascade, and this is a term coined particularly when it comes to the literature looking at burnout in education. So the burnout cascade means that when you have burnout symptoms, the more severe they become, the more you are likely to engage in something called maladaptive coping behavior. So what that means is just basically your way of dealing with that makes you act in ways that are detrimental to you and to those around you. So rather than, for example, helping your brain get moments of rest, you have more and more negative thoughts, and you can't stop them, and they are faster and faster, so your brain actually doesn't get much respite. So that's just one example. And certainly with the cost, you can actually, of course, look at turnover, look at your absences, looking at low productivity. And there's a very interesting study that was published at the beginning of this year in MIT Sloan, in the Sloan Management Review, and they were looking at top reasons why people were leaving organizations. So this was a massive analysis. I believe 3 million Glassdoor reviews by employees were analyzed. This is in the US, right? So they were trying to uncover the main factors behind the Great Resignation, and they found that toxic workplace culture is 10 times more likely to make someone leave an organization. And on the second, or I believe the third one, was high innovation cultures. And when you dig deep in the data, you see that that was synonymous for burnout, because those types of organizations that were high in innovation, such as SpaceX, for example, demanded or required their employees to work longer hours and all sorts of aspects of work that actually resulted in burnout. So absolutely, there is a link with all those aspects of work.
Thank you very much. I mean, you talk about a very large data set there, and looking at organizations. I'm sure Jared has some information from his data set to answer.
Yeah, well, so off the top of my head, so this is in 2020 data. Employees who were burnt out were about 3.5 times more likely to quit, but managers who were burnt out were 7.5 times more likely to quit on average. So that's the difference between burnt out and non-burnt out. So if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I'm hearing that burnout probably is an issue, I don't know whether that really is such a problem. It's going to be a problem, because as soon as top talent leaves, so the cost of turnover for a skilled worker is about 100% of salary. And you can ask any CFO and they will not show you a line on the balance sheet or the profit and loss saying, oh yeah, this is the cost of turnover, because we don't capture that thing. But that's what the research tells us. And the trouble is, it's not me walking out the door, it's that I actually think, man, I'm burnt out, I'm quitting this thing. I do my CV, I start doing all the extra job hunting, I start calling in sick. I forget to give the right love and respect to some customers, so we lose some clients who are important. I finally put my notice in because I leave. You then can't find anybody in this job market. The good news is immigration will have all your solutions in 8 to 12 months time. Oh my gosh, you finally get somebody and then you've got to train them up. And by that time, perhaps I've recovered. Now I'm working for your competitor. And now I'm showing love to that old client, and they shift over, and before you know it, organizations are going, man, it's a tough economic time. So there are those real financial pressures, and so, you know, encouraging business owners to look at their workforce and think, this isn't it's a well-being issue, but it's a performance issue, it's a cost issue, it's a competitive advantage or disadvantage if I let things go too much. So really is now, I think, you know, there are direct and plenty of hidden costs involved.
Absolutely. So hidden costs, but also actually hidden advantages maybe in getting it right, and then that become very transparent in terms of boosting productivity, because you've got staff that are committed and feeling looked after. There are some questions that are proving quite popular on Slido, and there's very much what people looking, it seems here, around a sort of assessment tool. So we talked about a risk diagnostic anywhere. maybe if we think about that around template assessment for businesses to sort of understand psychosocial hazards, or that sort of assessment tool. Sarah, is there a particular template or assessment that you use or would recommend?
Yeah, good question. Funnily enough, I know it's probably going to disagree with Jared and Georgie, right? Because you have wonderful measures, but ours is almost the anecdotal. I mean, that's almost the easiest thing you can start with, because one thing I'm really mindful of is that, especially in Queenstown, with so many businesses so short-staffed, if I turned up and said, look, I've got this really great, kind of assessment with all these questions that I want to do, they would go, I don't have time. I currently have a whole busload of tourists who've turned up. I've got one boat I can put them in. I don't even have time for that. So I guess, the place I would almost start is with the anecdotal. How are your people going? What are your conversations like? What are some of the things, if you actually talk to them and said, what are some of the things that are challenging right now? And they tell you those things. That's actually the most easy and best place to start. After that, yeah, there's lots of great measures out there. I'm sure, Jared and Georgie could look to those, from the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory to others that are available freely online.
I think actually, I think in some ways that helps answer that, very much that piece, that people are obviously feeling, the pressure financially. They want to do something better. We've got a question there around sort of free solutions. So I'm hearing very much that walk around, talk to people, ask them questions as a good starting point. But Georgie, you seem to be specifically talking about a sort of risk diagnostic tool. Tell us about some of those.
Yeah, and I agree with Sarah. Like, I agree. You qualitative data, so the data that you get from your employees is very valuable, right? So as a starting point, that is very important, and that is very easy for you to do. And then, of course, there are more sophisticated instruments that require you to analyze. And one of the things that I think it's important, so you have an instrument like Sarah mentioned, the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory or the Copenhagen Psychosocial Hazards Inventory. It is important to have a way to assess risk. So here's what I mean. An instrument like a survey like that one gives you a percentage. So let's say you have 60% in high workload, and you have also 80% in role clarity, and maybe you have 90% in lack of supervisor support. It's important for you to work with someone that can calculate a risk factor for you, because different aspects of work pose different risk to mental well-being. So for example, even if you are in a job, and we know this from literature, even if you are in a role that has high work demands or high workload, if you have enough job resources, you are not likely to have impairment in mental health. So there is, I'm talking about a model, the job demands resource model. So when you calculate risk of health impairment, it is important to take into account different factors, right? To actually see, because it's not enough to say, oh, well, they scored high on workload. Yes, okay, but what about the job resources that are available to them? So job resources are, for example, the relationship with supervisor, the relationship with colleagues, role clarity, the trust in the information received by managers and by colleagues. So these are just some examples. So it is important when you decide to implement whatever survey to take into account that you need a calculation of risk to health impairment to know for sure if something is a hazard or not. And I'm happy to talk to people about that. There are, in Australia, there is a free tool offered for Australian businesses. It's called People at Work Survey. To my knowledge, we don't have a similar tool in New Zealand as of now.
Okay, thanks very much. So sort of casting the net right from those sort of informal conversations through to being very rigorous and in terms of the diagnostic. But what about you, Jared, on this?
Yeah, well, actually, I kind of agree with Sarah. I think the qualitative is probably the easiest and cheapest one. And I'm, as an academic, do I have survey instruments? I sure do. And then part of my job is deconstructing it to make it worthwhile. But I think, you know, business, ask those managers, how's your workforce going? If everybody is happy, if turnover is low, if productivity is good, keep doing what you're doing. That's fabulous, but you're going to be in the minority for sure. The other 80%, spend some resources on managers. Keep them trained, keep them happy. Work for, you know, what's a cheap form of a resource is job autonomy and control. Working from home, for example, doesn't suit the cafes and restaurants and tourist activities in Queenstown, sure, but for lots of businesses, and you know, my data's showing we're getting about over 50%, somewhere around about 58, 60% of people doing some working from home, which is just astronomical compared to pre-COVID. Organizations that are saying no when you could actually do it, you know, those are the work, you know, that's going to make workers leave as well. So I think it's just about trying to take the pulse of the workforce. And remember, you as the CEO walking around probably aren't going to, you know, if you've got a workforce of even 20 people, people know who you are, and they may sell you the tacked on smile because they don't want to say to you, actually, I'm exhausted, you give us too much work. And so going down to the managers, get those people who are managing people to give you the pulse of their workforce. And we should be doing it all the time. And I think we've got, you know, in general, we've got so busy, we've got a little bit lazy. And but I do think the answers are there, and they will be, at least initially, cheap. But you know, if you've got a big workforce, having these kind of more complicated instruments does make things far easier, especially when you could break it down into different departments and things like that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. There's certainly a lot of interest in terms of the questions around the sort of tools that managers can have to support their staff. But certainly people looking for sort of free sort of solutions, and even sort of asking around, you know, just what are good questions to use. So I want to sort of pick up on some of those themes in a moment, but before we do that, I thought we might just do another poll, because we do have another poll question. And this question is really very much about your organisation, so the organisation that you're in at the moment. And so what we're interested in is whether you think at the moment your organisation is set up appropriately to recognise and manage burnout. Well, again, we sort of have very much a sort of very clear sort of response to people saying, well, you know, somewhat or no, that we're not. And again, more, you know, a result that's pretty clear in terms of people saying that, well, no, I don't think we are. And, you know, I think looking at our experts, no one is surprised to kind of hear that. So, you know, if organisations aren't set up appropriately, really, I'm very interested in hearing, you know, what sort of things you suggest organisations should do at this stage, because we've got lots of interest in tools for middle managers around this. What sort of free solutions there are, and even what are good questions to ask. So Jared, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so there'll definitely be elements around workload, whether it's the time, you know, it could be I only work 40, you know, we've got a long work culture, 55 hours a week as a World Health Organization. You increase your chance of dying of a heart attack 17% if that's your regular work week. So, but I could also work a 40-hour week or even a 37.5-hour week. But if the speed of the work feels like it never ends, that would be a big driver into burnout. So there are nuances, and it will depend on different organizations. You know, CEOs might want to engage that kind of senior leadership team and talk to them about how work is done. Try to pick up the work components. A lot of time, a lot of the rhetoric is, you know, workers need to be more resilient. Workers need to do as if workers are, you know, mainly in charge of all of these drivers to burnout. It does tend to be more the organisation. So encouraging organisations to have an honest look at themselves, try to identify some, you know, if we can identify that, man, we have 5 meetings a week on average. You know, my advice would be that's probably 4.5 too many. I once said to a boss, I said, you know, he said, you're not coming to the meeting. And I said, it's death by meetings, David, that was his name. he's not in this country. Because we met every day and they just got longer and longer. And guess what? You go to a meeting to get more work and have less time because you've got more meetings. So I think it's just kind of identifying a few key areas, and maybe you've got a couple of teams that are down on staff and people have just been working non-stop. You know, those need to be the critical places we need to plug in with some staff if you can get it. So I think it's just trying to perhaps not even take the pulse of the workforce. Know that most workforces are under the pump. It is totally COVID related because we've seen the burnout rates just increase astronomically all around the world, and we've all shared this kind of COVID thing. And I think just looking for one or two key solution areas: workload, speed, staffing, pressure, you know, less meetings or whatever, and maybe some working from home because it may cost organizations very little.
Fantastic. Okay, so two things stood out to me around just really thinking as a manager, thinking about where's the workload particularly heavy because of vacancies or just because of the pressure that's there. And also, I think that meetings one comes up quite a lot about just the way in which having meetings becomes part of a ritual. And I have heard of organisations that have done things like say, well, let's just cancel recurring meetings, then start to put them back in. So yeah, you would have liked that one, yeah. Jared. So a couple of nice practical things there. What about for you, Sarah? You know, could you give us 2 or 3 sort of good practical tips where you suggest people to start?
Well, actually, I wrote down three examples of organisations we're working with at the moment because I thought that might be an easy way to illustrate them. So the first one's in the legal industry. It's a legal firm, and you know, we know that many of the challenges around burnout are hard baked into the work that they do, and some of it's, you know, beyond their scope of control. For example, you know, government deadlines and expectations, or client deadlines around, you know, burnout. And one of the things we've been sort of joking with our legal colleagues is that no one ever rings a lawyer and says, "I've got good news." You know, when lawyers are always on the receiving end of bad news and having to deal with problems, and so the challenges that they're dealing with are specific. You know, obviously not just that industry, but to that industry. And so the solutions, you know, need to fall out of that. So one of the things we've been doing is working with their senior leadership team, again, to say, well, what are the dials that I can turn if those ones are rusted into place? So maybe it is, as Jared was saying, like the working from home. Maybe it's the way that we design contracts with clients. And maybe we can start to shift the dial and say, can we have an extra day to do that work? Instead of the expectation always be, if the client says jump, we jump. The next one that I'm thinking of is a hospitality tourism one, and again we're working with the senior leadership team around this, and they're really just noticing that because there are so few staff on the ground, it really is trying to do get the most out of the few resources that are there. So for them, actually, because of the nature of the work that they're in, and everyone is really passionate about the work that they do, and I think this is often quite typical of those who fall into that burnout hole, isn't it? They get really passionate. And so for them, it's actually trying to boost that support around them. So it is having someone, they have someone who works most of the hours that this organization is open, actually sitting on the floor in the building as a kind of help person they can go and talk to, almost like a social worker, if you like. You know, in schools, they call it the Swiss program, social worker in schools, very similar concept. And then for this other organization I'm thinking of, it was actually, they have employees who work a long way from shore, and so it's been actually doing things like improving the Wi-Fi so they can stay connected to their family and friends. It's been improving the quality of the food so that they're able to kind of, you know, improve the nutrition. Like it's like all these little basic building blocks that have made people feel more valued and more rewarded, even though you can't change the fact that there's all these other things that are in the way. So in some ways it's a little bit specific depending on the industry, even though the symptoms are all the same.
Yes, but I think what was really nice about those examples was they were about different organizations, different industry, and different sort of solutions. So I think there's a sort of range, clearly there's a range of things that people can do that are specific for them and their situation, and which don't involve a huge investment in some program or something. It's just practical stuff to do on a day-to-day basis. What sort of hints and tips do you start off with Georgie, around these sort of things?
I think the most important thing is to find out the root causes in your organization, right? And so start with what you have now in terms of information. So an engagement survey, if that's all you have, that's okay. what you can do is include some questions in your engagement survey that can help you capture more of this data. And so you mentioned, John, examples of questions. So for example, with burnout, right? When we talk about burnout, what is burnout, right? If we use the definition of the World Health Organization, it's an occupational syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress unsuccessfully managed. Well, you need to think about the fact that in practice, two of the most easily noticeable aspects of burnout or manifestations of burnout are tiredness, some form of exhaustion, and some form of disengagement. So you can include questions in your engagement survey around that. You know, do you feel tired before you arrive at work? You know, do you feel that your work does not allow you to have enough energy for your private life or for your personal life? Do you have work-life balance, right? And then include open-ended questions, right? And ask for examples. So that is a way for you to identify the root causes in your organization. And then based on that, the solution is going to emerge. And what I recommend, if you are in a small organization, you are in a wonderful position to co-create that solution with your people, right? The smaller the organization, the easier it is for you and your people leaders to work together and co-create that solution. In order to get data that is valid, so you can use these surveys, use the open-ended questions, the examples that I just gave you to get you started, but also have one of your managers, if you have a health and safety manager, for example, have that person conduct focus groups, right? Or someone that people can trust or be able to open up to. You can even get an external consultant that just runs those focus groups for you. But it's important for you to identify the root causes in your business, and the solutions will emerge from that. And those are going to be the solutions that make the most impact for you and your people.
Thank you. So larger organizations that perhaps have surveys, be the engagement or sort of pulse surveys, thinking about how they can put in questions that specifically relate to well-being in that to help them to know exactly where they may best spend their attention after that. Smaller organizations leveraging that smallness to actually work very closely with individuals and managers and teams to build solutions that are right for them. Those seem like sort of two very sort of practical steps that organizations can take. So thank you very much for that. That's very useful. There's a very intriguing question that's come up on Slido, which is around sort of managing up the awareness of burnout in the organization. So I would take this to mean, you know, you're an individual contributor in an organization and you're thinking, my goodness, it's getting quite tough around here. I'm noticing these various symptoms from my colleagues and peers. How do I sort of let my senior leaders know about this? How do I bring this to their awareness? Sort of any ideas or ways that you would recommend people might sort of try and bring it to attention of senior leaders in the organization that might appear not to have noticed it to date? What do you think, Sarah?
Oh boy, I've been there. And at working in a toxic environment, feeling those signs of burnout. And that's really hard if the leaders at the top are the ones who are contributing to burnout, because, you know, how do you have that conversation? I mean, in an ideal world, you would be able to either go and talk to your immediate manager, you'll be able to go and talk to HR, you would be able to perhaps talk to another senior leader. I guess if your organization is big enough and there is somebody within the senior leadership team that you have a rapport with and you feel that you can safely have that conversation with, that can be a good place to go. Otherwise, you're starting to look at some external supports. You know, maybe it's tapping into an EAP process and and asking them for some support and ideas around how to manage the situation that you're in. Maybe it's, you know, accessing another service to get some advice. But yeah, I have been there, so it is hard. I mean, I think what you want to do is make it as much as possible about the things that we've talked about, job demands, resourcing, those sorts of things, rather than make it a personal thing. Because for some reason that seems to resonate better with leaders, in my experience.
Yes, thank you. So really sort of it sounds like, you know, displaying a bit of openness and transparency upwards in the organization and speaking, and people relating to that when they hear it. What about you, Georgie? Sort of any sort of tips for, you know, if you're feeling that your colleagues are getting burnt out, or you're feeling a bit like that yourself, about how do you kind of raise that with your leaders in the organization?
I think very similar to what Sarah said. I agree with that approach. So I think depending on what your position is within your organization and what your relationship is with your immediate superior, with your immediate manager, that's going to dictate how you approach it. What I found best is that an evidence-based approach works, right? So when you go into that meeting, you already have a list prepared with your observations, right? So for example, what symptoms of mental distress or burnout have you noticed? I've noticed this and this. I've noticed that this impacts our productivity in this and this way, right? I've noticed that for the last, for example, 2 weeks, the team has been short-staffed, which means the workload for the existing members has been high. They've been working overtime. I've noticed emails being sent at 9 p.m., 10 p.m., emails being sent at the weekend. I know that that is a sign that this is not okay. And it's useful if you can quote sources. And that's really good. Like, so for example, I run a free training every month, and I give people sources so they can quote when they put this business case. And I use inverted commas because I dislike this term. Why do we have to put a business case for mental health? It's 2022. I would hope the awareness is there, but anyway, we still have to put business cases together for that. But that's where you go. So you go with specific examples of what you've noticed, specific examples of how you've noticed that's impacting work, and then if you can add in some sources that shows how that is detrimental, then you have a good starting point for a conversation that cannot be ignored, right? Even if a leader believes that, oh, you know, whatever beliefs they have or about well-being being a fluffy buzzword, you know.
Thank you very much, Georgie. I think, you know, from your previous answers, I should have realised you were going to talk about data and being evidence-based. And
I'm the robot. No emotions, only numbers. That's not true, actually.
But finding those examples that bring it to life to managers around things that you've noticed, I think that's terrific. Jared.
Yeah, so I did it not in my most recent research, but end of last year in November, I asked people they had done an earlier component on burnout, and then I described some of the key signals and said, you know, how do you see yourself? And my data showed a good 1/3 of people were right on the money, 1/3. So I had people who were clearly into this burnt out thing saying, no, I'm totally fine. And I was just thinking, like, geez, those are, so we're probably much better at calling out our teammates and going, wow, he's got kind of, he's getting quite kind of emotional. And Sarah talked about the crying husband there. You know, those are the signals, and we see them better in others than ourselves. Some will see it in themselves, and that's great. But it's probably worth reminding people the majority won't. And perhaps a good conversation is to go to your manager and say, not me, but in my team, and then I don't have to necessarily name names, but, you know, I'm seeing a lot of fatigue. We're struggling in the first hour of the day, not the last hour. You know, I'm seeing emotional, you know, someone's getting angry and yelling, and they've never been like this for the last couple of years. We're really under the pump. And I'm just bringing it to your attention because, you know, you need to be aware of it. If you go into any of the major New Zealand news media and type in job burnout in the last kind of year or two, you'll get plenty of nice, easy breezy, you know, not academic, thankfully, but, you know, nice, simple articles on burnout, just to kind of say that, hey, this thing is out here and it's really common. And to be honest, if senior leaders are, you know, we talked about the toxic culture. If you have a toxic culture, don't go and talk to the CEO, just leave. Leave now and go and find another job. That would be my advice, because you'll just bang your head against the wall. As brutal as that sounds, and we do need to remember, if you are the leader of an organization and you've had the term, this is a toxic place to work, you know, that's why turnover will be high and productivity isn't so good. You know, you need to do something about it. And I think we have been quite slack. And, you know, and somebody mentioned something about bullying early on. You know, those kind of things just drive a poor culture. So one way to front foot it is to kind of say, actually, maybe let's have a reset. We've got Mental Health Week coming up. Let's change our approach. It won't happen easily if you are a toxic company. But one of those might be trying to find those key leaders who are,
yes,
you know, high on the dark triad of, you know, narcissists and try to move those ones along, because it's probably, you know, detrimentally affecting the whole organization.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jared. Look, we're running quite close to the end, so I just thought if each speaker could, in less than a minute each, just give a kind of, you know, closing thought of that. And if anybody knows the reference for the study about the middle managers being 143 times more likely, if they can include that reference in their 1 minute, that would be great. If not, we'll find it and we'll include it in the email out afterwards. So Sarah, your 60 seconds starts now.
All right, my 60 seconds looks like this. I'm going to talk about leadership. I'm going to say, as a leader, the number one thing you need to do is take care of yourself first and foremost. You cannot support those around you unless you're taking care of yourself. Second of all, then you need to start getting commitment across your leadership team. And if you're somebody who's you know, able to influence your leadership team, then that's a really good place to start. Make sure you've got that commitment, that visibility, that data, as Georgie was talking about, in front of you, so you can make some really good choices and decisions. And number three is actually just do something. You know, there are some things, if we take, say, what used to be the DHB environment, healthcare workers are innately in a really highly pressured environment, but there will be some dials that you can turn, and they might even be just tiny little shifts that you can make. Do whatever you can right now. Don't start, you know, later. Now is the time to get started. We all have a responsibility.
Thanks very much. That's a powerful message. Georgie, what's your closing message?
That change is possible, and it doesn't require necessarily time or incredible resources. Change is possible when you know exactly what are the root causes, and when you engage with your people, you can together with them create a positive culture for you and them. And the study is actually Jared's study, and it's I believe it's available on the AUT page. It's the study, I think it's from 2020, Jared. I can send everyone the link. Yeah.
Fantastic, Georgie. Getting the answer in and or within the time, and handing over to Jared for a final word from Jared.
Thanks, Georgie. So I've got about 4 articles from COVID on burnout. So and I'm happy to share those resources. And to Sarah's point, essential workers are another high risk group. Leaders, you're at least twice the risk of burnt out. Men and women, no difference. Public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, no difference. Firm size, no real difference there either. So it's so my most recent data, 22.5% of the workforce are at that high risk of being burnt out. And then we've got this another chunk on the severe level. So it is common. It's not good that it's common. 22% should be 7% or less. In a perfect world,
thanks,
1%.
Thanks very much, Jared. That's a great point to end on. And thanks very much to Sarah and to Georgie for your contributions today as well. It's been very interesting listening to the different perspectives. One thing I wanted to mention just as we finish is that there is a website that may answer some of the queries you had called First Steps, that has a free workplace well-being program on, and a risk diagnostic tool. So that might be something for people to look at. We'd include that in the resources that we send out afterwards, as well as others. But really for today, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined in terms of on Slido with the questions and the polls. We hope this has helped you to think about this very important workplace issue. So that really represents the end of our webinar for today. Thank you all for coming. Nā rai ra tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou.